The deeper Anne searched, the more dangerous the records became. Buried beneath harmless descriptions of maintenance and family expenses was an inheritance structure designed to survive generations. Yet after the Queen's death, something had shifted, and Camilla's secret accounts appeared to be standing at the centre of it. At first, the transfers looked almost ordinary. Investment income, revenue from historic properties. Money set aside for repairs, staff, security, and the long-term protection of the royal household. But Anne had spent too many years inside the monarchy to be distracted by polite labels. She understood that the most serious palace decisions were rarely written in alarming language. They were hidden beneath careful phrases, softened by procedure, and protected by the assumption that no member of the family would dare question them. The money, she discovered, had not come from public royal funding. It had been drawn from private holdings associated with Queen Elizabeth II's personal estate, funds built across decades and quietly reserved for future generations. The late Queen had guarded those assets through a web of internal rules. They were not parliamentary laws, nor were they written for public debate. They survived through loyalty, discretion, and the authority of a monarch whose word had once been enough to stop any challenge before it began. But that authority was gone. After the accession, several protected funds had been reclassified as expenses connected to the new royal household. On paper, it was a technical adjustment. In practice, it opened a hidden door. Money once treated as collective family wealth could now move through structures linked to Charles's office and Camilla's private advisors. Then, Anne found the jewellery agreement. The pieces named in the document were not crown jewels. That made them more vulnerable, not less important. They had been worn by Queen Elizabeth II and the Queen Mother, appearing at moments that had shaped the monarchy's public memory. Their value was not measured only in diamonds or historic craftsmanship. Each piece carried a story, a symbol, and a claim to continuity. One disputed clause appeared to give Camilla lasting influence over how certain jewels would be worn, displayed, and eventually distributed. Anne immediately understood the danger. Control the jewels, and one could control which royal woman inherited their symbolism. Control their public use, and one could influence how future generations remembered the past. The secret accounts appeared to be paying for private valuations, transportation, insurance, and specialised security. To Anne, the pattern suggested preparation. These treasures were not merely being protected, they were being positioned for a new legal classification, one that might place them beyond the reach of William, Catherine, Harry, and other future heirs. The discovery reopened an old divide between Anne and Charles. Anne believed royal inheritance was a duty held temporarily for those who came next. Charles believed the reigning sovereign possessed the authority to shape the institution according to present needs. And Camilla's future security had now become tied to decisions made while Charles still held the crown. One transfer disturbed Anne more than the others. It had been authorised shortly before a private family gathering from which Harry had been excluded. The timing raised a darker possibility. Decisions involving Diana-linked possessions may have been made without both of her sons. Anne considered telling William. But involving the heir could look less like protection and more like rebellion against the king. Anne needed proof that the accounts were controlled deliberately rather than created through harmless bureaucracy, and that proof arrived in the form of a private instruction bearing Camilla's own approval. Until that moment, Camilla could have claimed ignorance, blamed advisors, or dismissed the transfers as routine palace accounting. Then, Anne uncovered a signed instruction authorising the movement of funds and valuables, and the careful wording suggested the Queen Consort understood exactly what was being hidden from the wider family. The document arrived through a former palace official who had quietly kept a copy after becoming uneasy about the way the arrangement had been approved. It carried no dramatic confession and no careless admission. Instead, it looked controlled, polished, and almost harmless. Yet Camilla's approval appeared clearly at the bottom, authorizing several accounts to be brought together beneath what advisors called a confidential continuity structure. Its stated purpose was to protect the Queen Consort's financial independence in the years after Charles's reign. On the surface, that goal could be defended. Camilla would need security, residences, staff, and protection, but Anne immediately recognised that the document went far beyond ordinary personal support. Every phrase had been chosen with extraordinary care. Post-reign security, private household continuity, restricted beneficiary access. Nothing sounded openly improper. That was what made it so troubling. The language appeared designed to reassure anyone reading quickly while quietly preventing future heirs from questioning where the wealth had gone or who controlled it. One clause disturbed Anne more than all the others. It allowed Camilla's representatives to retain authority over selected assets even after Charles's death. That meant the next monarch might inherit the crown without gaining control of wealth, ceremonial possessions, and historic objects connected to the previous reign. A separate centre of influence could remain in place, loyal not to the sovereign, but to Camilla's private household. The accounts included provisions for members of her family, trusted employees, residences, security arrangements, and personal ceremonial items. Anne did not believe Camilla should be left unprotected. Her concern was far more serious. Legitimate private needs appeared to have been mixed with inherited funds and historic property that belonged to a wider royal legacy. Suddenly, Anne remembered earlier disagreements over jewellery Camilla had worn as queen. Camilla had repeatedly sought clearer answers about which pieces were hers, which belonged to Charles, and which would return to the royal collection. At the time, those conversations had seemed emotional, perhaps driven by fear of what might happen after the king was gone. Now, they looked like part of a much larger plan. Beside Camilla's signature was an approval code from the king's private office, but it did not prove how much Charles knew. Had he examined the arrangement himself? Had he trusted advisors without reading the details? Or had the most dangerous clauses been buried beneath language he was never encouraged to challenge? Then Anne learned that a palace lawyer had objected to the structure and was later removed from the process. His warning had been blunt. Discovery could bring serious reputational consequences. But the most explosive reference was only 3 words long: D-related property. It could have meant a trust, an internal category, or something else entirely. Yet Anne could not ignore the possibility that it referred to Diana. That possibility ended her hesitation. She summoned Camilla to a private meeting, determined to demand the truth before William, Harry, or the public discovered it first. The confrontation was intended to remain controlled and private, but Camilla's response transformed Anne's suspicion into certainty and pushed the royal family towards a battle neither woman could contain. No courtiers were invited, no official minutes were taken, and Charles was deliberately kept away. Behind a locked palace door, Anne placed the copied ledger in front of Camilla and asked one devastating question: why had royal money been moved into accounts the future king might never control? Anne did not waste time with polite greetings or careful introductions. She placed the transfer records, approval pages, account codes, and jewellery references between them. Every document had been arranged in order. Every unexplained payment led to another uncomfortable question. Camilla could see immediately that this was not a conversation she could dismiss with a vague assurance from an advisor. Anne had come prepared, and denial would no longer be enough. Camilla remained controlled. She described the accounts as responsible preparation, not deception. The wife of a monarch, she argued, could not be expected to face the end of a reign with no protection of her own. After Charles, a new household would take control. New advisors would arrive. Old promises could be forgotten. Even personal security, residences, and loyal staff might suddenly depend on decisions made by people who had never truly accepted her. Anne did not challenge Camilla's right to security. She challenged the method. These were not merely private savings or personal arrangements. Historic jewels and inherited assets had been drawn into the same structure. To Anne, Camilla's advisors had created something far more dangerous, a private royal system hidden inside the monarchy, capable of surviving Charles and continuing to exercise influence beyond the authority of the next king. Camilla pushed back. Royal widows had always been protected through property, jewellery, income, and trusted households. She insisted that Charles had made promises to her, and she would not allow those promises to be quietly reversed by William or by officials serving a new reign. Then the argument became personal. Camilla suggested that Anne's real objection had little to do with money. Perhaps, she said, Anne had never fully accepted her place beside Charles. Anne's reply was cold and immediate. This was not about whom Charles had married. It was about what no consort had the right to remove from the inheritance of those who came next. Anne then raised the phrase that had haunted the entire investigation: related property. For the first time, Camilla's composure appeared to weaken. She did not explain the meaning. Instead, she said certain possessions had become politically dangerous and needed protection from being used against the king. Anne understood the implication. She demanded to know whether Diana's belongings had been valued, moved, insured, or placed under Camilla's private control. Camilla refused to answer without Charles present and moved to end the meeting. Anne warned that involving the king would not erase the records. William had a direct interest in anything connected to his mother and his future reign. Before leaving, Camilla delivered one final warning. Exposing the accounts would not only destroy her reputation, it could shatter public confidence in Charles. The words were calm, but Anne heard the threat beneath them. Family loyalty now stood against royal duty. Anne chose to approach her brother first, hoping he might dismantle the structure before either of his sons learned the truth. Yet when Anne finally placed the evidence before Charles, his reaction revealed that the king knew far more than she had hoped and feared far more than he was willing to admit. Anne expected anger, disbelief, perhaps even immediate action. Instead, Charles stared at the documents with the exhausted silence of a man who already understood the danger. His refusal to challenge Camilla did not end the crisis. It convinced William that the crown itself was being placed at risk. Charles did not deny that plans had been made to protect Camilla's future. He spoke instead about the years she had spent under public attack, the humiliation she had endured, and the uncertainty that had followed her into royal life. He had promised, he said, that she would never again be forced to depend on the kindness of people who might later turn against her. To Charles, the accounts were not an act of betrayal. They were the fulfillment of a private vow. Anne listened, but she refused to let sympathy erase responsibility. Protecting Camilla was one thing. Giving her household lasting control over inherited money, historic possessions, and royal jewels was something else entirely. Promises made through love, guilt, or regret could not be allowed to outweigh obligations to the crown, the wider family, and the reign that would follow. Charles insisted that the disputed wealth was private, and therefore his to arrange. Anne challenged him immediately. The funds had come from holdings shaped by generations of royal inheritance. Some were tied to restrictions understood within the family, while others appeared connected to heirlooms that carried meaning far beyond their financial value. The line between personal property and royal responsibility was not as clear as Charles wanted it to be. When Anne mentioned the possible Diana connection, his tone changed. He claimed that certain possessions had been reorganized to prevent endless arguments between family households, charities, museums, historians, and advisors. In his telling, the arrangement had created order. To Anne, it looked like control disguised as protection. She demanded an independent review. Charles refused. Any written investigation, he warned, could leak and create the appearance of corruption, even if private lawyers eventually defended every decision. The monarchy might survive the truth, but perhaps not the suspicion surrounding it. The disagreement became painfully personal. Charles accused Anne of forcing him to choose between his sister and his wife. Anne told him the choice had already been created by the hidden accounts. The only question was whether he would defend the monarchy before someone else forced him to do it publicly. William soon learned of the dispute through an alarmed advisor. He asked Anne to see the records, but she hesitated. An heir challenging a reigning king over money and inheritance could look like the beginning of a succession struggle. Then, William found his own evidence. Certain jewellery inventories and estate documents had been blocked from his household. Catherine recognised the danger immediately. Objects expected to support the next queen's ceremonial role might already be locked into arrangements beyond their control. This was not about personal desire, it was about continuity. William confronted Charles privately. The king dismissed the matter as a family arrangement and ordered him not to involve Harry, warning that Diana's younger son would turn a contained dispute into a national spectacle. That warning revealed too much. By naming Harry, Charles confirmed that Diana's legacy was somehow involved. William tried to contain the crisis, but a sealed inventory carrying Diana's name reached Harry before the palace could stop it, and the youngest son responded with a move nobody had prepared for. Harry had been excluded from the meetings, the inheritance discussions, and the private warnings. Then, an anonymous package arrived containing account records and an inventory linked to Diana. Within hours, his anger moved beyond family resentment and became a direct challenge to the authority of the king. The package contained no explanation and no name. Inside were transfer codes, valuation reports, jewellery descriptions, and a partial inventory carrying references to possessions connected to Diana. Some of the objects were valuable, but others were painfully ordinary. Letters, private gifts, presentation pieces, and items tied to her humanitarian work. To Harry, their importance could never be measured in money. They were fragments of a mother he had lost, and the idea that they had been moved, classified, or controlled without his knowledge reopened a wound the palace had never truly allowed to heal. His first call was to William. The conversation turned bitter almost immediately. Harry accused his brother of knowing more than he had admitted and protecting the institution while their mother's legacy was being divided behind closed doors. William rejected the accusation. He said he had been trying to establish the truth before acting, knowing that one reckless move could make it impossible to recover anything quietly. But Harry heard caution as complicity. William heard Harry's anger as a threat that could destroy every chance of resolving the matter privately. The old divide between them returned with brutal force. One brother trusted control, the other believed control was exactly how truth had always been buried. Harry then contacted Anne. She did not deny that the records raised serious questions. That honesty earned part of his trust. Yet when she urged him not to release unverified material, he heard the familiar language of delay. Wait. Stay silent. Let the palace handle it. Promises that secrecy would eventually produce fairness had been made before, and Harry no longer believed them. Then, he found the detail that changed everything. One hidden account appeared to have funded legal advice about limiting public access to Diana-related archives. This was no longer only about inheritance or jewellery. It was about control over memory itself. Who could tell Diana's story, which documents could be seen, and what future generations would be allowed to know. Camilla's representatives denied any improper involvement. They claimed ordinary administrative costs had been twisted into accusations of personal enrichment. Harry rejected the explanation. The structure had been designed to survive Charles's reign, and that made it impossible for him to view it as a simple household arrangement. Charles called him personally and demanded the documents be returned. Harry asked whether his father had approved the accounts and whether Camilla's household controlled possessions that should belong to Diana's sons. Charles did not give the clear answer he wanted. Instead, he warned that exposure could wound the monarchy, damage charities, and humiliate people who could not defend themselves without revealing even more private information. Harry's response was cold. Secrecy, he said, had always been defended as protection for the crown, while the emotional cost was carried by everyone else. He knew another interview could be dismissed. Another leak could be denied, so he contacted lawyers, financial investigators, and parliamentary figures, preparing to force the documents beyond palace control. Harry was no longer preparing another public accusation. He was preparing to place royal finances before institutions the palace could not command, and Anne realised the reckoning had entered an entirely new phase. For decades, Anne had obeyed the monarchy's oldest survival rule: family disputes remained behind palace walls. But with Harry preparing to force an outside investigation, she chose to speak first, and in one controlled statement, she connected Camilla directly to accounts the nation had never known existed. Anne understood that silence was no longer protecting the crown. It was creating a vacuum, and that vacuum would soon be filled by leaked pages, half-explained transfers, angry accusations, and competing versions of the truth. Once Harry placed the records beyond palace control, the monarchy would lose the power to explain what had happened on its own terms. Anne decided that the institution could survive an uncomfortable admission more easily than an uncontrolled explosion. Her statement was written with extraordinary care. It confirmed that financial arrangements connected to inheritance, historic possessions, and private royal holdings required urgent examination. Then came the line that changed everything. The Queen Consort's private household was identified as the authority linked to the disputed accounts. Anne did not accuse Camilla of stealing money. She did something more difficult to dismiss. She questioned who owned the assets, who could benefit from them, why access had been restricted, and whether inherited funds had been mixed with personal protections. She also raised concerns over jewellery classifications and arrangements that might continue after Charles's reign. The restraint made the statement devastating. Anne did not sound like a bitter sister attacking her brother's wife. She sounded like a reluctant guardian warning that royal continuity had been placed in danger. Charles tried to stop the release. He warned that a public statement from the Princess Royal would be seen as a declaration of war against Camilla and, by extension, against the king himself. Anne refused to retreat. The conflict, she told him, had not begun with her words. It had begun when secret financial structures were placed above open family agreement. Camilla felt deeply betrayed. She believed Anne had taken plans designed to secure her future and transformed them into evidence of hidden ambition. Worse, the scandal revived the darkest suspicion that had followed her for years, that she had not only taken Diana's place beside Charles, but might now be gaining control over a legacy never meant to become hers. William supported an independent review, but he would not stand publicly beside Anne. An open alliance between the heir and the Princess Royal could look like a coordinated challenge to the sovereign. The palace responded quickly, insisting that every arrangement had been lawful and properly advised. Yet, the statement failed to answer the questions gripping Britain. Why had the accounts been hidden? Why had future heirs been denied access? And what exactly did the records mean by Diana-related property? Inside the palace, panic spread. Advisors resigned. Lawyers demanded distance. Some insisted the arrangements could be defended, while others warned that legality would not erase the moral damage if Camilla had benefited at the expense of Diana's sons or the next reign. Harry saw Anne's statement as proof that pressure worked, but he believed she had revealed only the doorway, not what lay behind it. Ignoring William's warning that the consequences could never be reversed, he authorised the next step. Anne had exposed the existence of the accounts, but Harry was about to expose their contents, and his next decision would drag a private royal conflict into the full view of Britain. Britain expected another interview, another memoir, or another bitter accusation from across the Atlantic. Harry did something far more dangerous. He submitted the financial records to outside authorities and surrendered his own inheritance claims, daring the palace to prove that Diana's legacy had never been traded for silence. This was no longer a family argument hidden behind palace doors. Harry formally requested an independent legal examination of the accounts, sending copies of the records to financial investigators, trustees, and representatives, with the authority to question how privately inherited assets had been moved. By taking the documents outside royal control, he removed the palace's ability to delay, soften, or quietly bury the dispute. Then came the decision that shocked even those closest to him. Harry suspended his own claim to every disputed payment, possession, and inheritance item until independent experts established who truly owned them. It was a calculated sacrifice. The palace could no longer dismiss his challenge as an attempt to gain money. He had placed his own financial interest on the table and stepped away from it. In a public statement, Harry insisted the fight was not about enlarging his inheritance. It was about determining whether property linked to the monarchy, Queen Elizabeth, or Diana had been redirected without the informed agreement of those expected to protect it in the future. The decision changed the public mood. Even people who had long questioned Harry's motives recognised the force of what he had done. By risking his own claim, he gave the challenge a moral weight the palace had not expected. Charles was devastated. To him, this was more than legal pressure. It was a public declaration that his word could no longer be trusted by his own son. Every private assurance he had offered now appeared powerless against the records Harry had released. Camilla's advisors prepared a defence, arguing that the accounts had been created through lawful private agreements. Yet each explanation produced new questions. The documents showed that access had been restricted deliberately and that parts of the structure were meant to survive beyond Charles's reign. William found himself trapped between loyalty to the king and duty to the future crown. At last, he called for all historically significant jewels and Diana-related possessions to be placed under temporary independent trusteeship. Anne backed him without hesitation. Affection, resentment, and private promises, she argued, could not decide the fate of assets carrying family and national meaning. Camilla offered to surrender control of selected accounts and jewels, but she refused to admit wrongdoing. She maintained that she had only tried to protect herself from being erased when Charles was gone. That was the tragedy at the centre of everything. Charles's attempt to secure Camilla's future had instead exposed her to greater suspicion, broken his trust with Anne, divided his sons, and brought Diana's memory back into the heart of the monarchy. The palace finally announced an independent review. The accounts were frozen. The disputed jewels were secured. Confidential inheritance instructions were placed under examination, and Britain was left with one question: had Harry saved the monarchy by forcing it to confront its secrets, Or had he destroyed the final bond between a king, his sister, his wife, and his sons?